Well, good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Let's go ahead and get this underway because the hour has approached. I'm Rear Admiral Buzz Busby, retired. Was formerly the Maritime Administrator about this time last year, and been asked to come back and talk, moderate this panel here this afternoon, which I think is a very topical set of issues made in America. First, I'd like to thank the Navy League for putting on this event and this particular topic. One of the many things that have kind of emerged from this last couple of years of COVID-19 impacts and second-order impacts have been kind of a rude awakening for many, not for all, but for many, for the globally interconnected supply chain that we all sort of live under these days. I don't think many people appreciated the extent to which we rely on goods and services outside of our continental and boundaries. I think an underappreciated aspect of that supply chain is the degree to which many capabilities and industries have left our shores either totally or significantly over the past several decades to become really dominant in other countries. While often this has been pursued for economic reasons, this has introduced dependencies and arguably national security risks in many areas and many industries. At the very least, it's shown that just-in-time logistics isn't always just in time. And some capabilities really must always reside on our shores. In the shipbuilding sector in particular, we have seen this flight overseas for many decades now, since at least the 70s and 80s. And other than the Jones Act and government shipbuilding programs, we probably wouldn't have that industry here at all, if not. So what to do? Well, we've seen some efforts to bring some industries and capabilities back on shore, and we've seen a lot of those in the press recently. There still remains to be much to be done. And to what degree should our government be involved, or should just strictly be a commercial business set of decisions? Joining me today to discuss where we are and what might be done to put the U.S. On a stronger footing are two captains of industry. Mr. George Whittier is CEO of Fairbanks Morse Defense, a well-known and long-standing producer of engines and power sources and auxiliaries for military and commercial applications. George has over 27 years in the manufacturing and engineering systems world and assumed his current position leading Fairbanks Morse Defense in January 2020. To my immediate left is Mr. Tracy Howard, who's CEO and president of Spartan, a world leader in design, development, testing, and production of complex marine electronics systems, including sonobuoys in support of anti-submarine warfare and maritime capabilities supporting undersea warfare. Tracy served for 27 years in the U.S. Navy as a submariner, commanded USS Salt Lake City, and was Commodore of the Submarine Squadron 16. So with that, the way we're gonna run things here this afternoon is I'm gonna ask each of our panelists to spend about 5 minutes talking a little bit about where they live in the sector and a little bit about their background. And then I'll tee up a couple of questions for them to start discussing some of this area that we need to explore here this afternoon. About halfway through, we'll turn it over to you all. We'll open the floor mic up for anybody who might have a comment or a question, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation, and we'll wrap it up about 13:30 or so. So with that, George or Tracy, let's go
Tracy's
first.
up first.
Thanks, Admiral. So we'll go ahead and tee up and talk about Spartan, which is my role right now leading the Spartan company. We are, as we'll talk about and is worth understanding. We are an Elbit Systems of America company. But we have been a defense contractor for over 70 years, largely, as the Admiral mentioned, building sonobuoys and other undersea payloads. I've had the privilege of leading the team here for almost 4 or 5 months with a history after the Navy of being in the manufacturing, leadership of manufacturing of tactical systems and payloads. So it's very interesting, as we talked about ahead of time, this discussion, very different perspectives, both tactical and then other supporting systems. Mine has been on the tactical focus, and with Spartan, we build the majority of the sonobuoys for the U.S. Navy as well as our allies that all fly the P-8 ASW system as well as the legacy P-3 systems. Additionally, as I mentioned, undersea payloads for the broader undersea warfare payloads that can be delivered from submarines or can be delivered independently. So because of that, you might imagine that we get into some classified type programs, sensitive programs. It's a very interesting governance arrangement that we have to provide that security. We have a separate proxy board supporting the security classified work that we do. And while we still at the same time were able to get the support of our ESA parent company, who is also a defense contractor here in the U.S. And so that is a exciting time for us as we look to grow after our first year as part of ESA to bring not only just the payloads, but look more towards systems of systems approaches to help the undersea warfare fight. When we ask the question of made in America, what does that mean? For me, that means, and for our company, that means we have a manufacturing plant that we manufacture everything that we deliver in the U.S. We use largely domestic vendors, but in some cases there are components that come from overseas. And to the Admiral's point about the supply chain and COVID, we're all living the dream that many of us out here that are involved in business are, which is both global constraints as well as the local impacts due to other economic challenges, whether it be electronics or other raw materials. But as we do this, from just to close my Spartan perspective, as the Navy in the current situation, as we're all aware of with Russia and Ukraine and the Russian resurgence, if you will, the Navy's ASW focus is heightened. And the Navy operates with a reserve of sonobuoys that they use for their auxiliary or their anti-submarine warfare mission. We're poised to continue to supply that along with other partners for the U.S. Navy, and we're growing, in fact, to support that and to expand our other undersea warfare capabilities. If you go to the next slide, just to reiterate, we are that little star there in that little on the map area in Florida. We've been there for almost 40 years. And again, we are now part of the larger defense network or company that is Elbit Systems of America, but dedicated team that I'm able to lead that does our manufacturing, delivers our product right out of the area there in a small town called De Leon Springs, west of Daytona Beach. So we are truly a made in America industry and workforce and company.
Great, thanks, Tracy. George?
We go to, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I was meeting with retired Admiral Dave Johnson a little bit ago, and he said, "Oh, Fairbanks Force, you guys are more than engines." And I said, "You just gave my speech. Do you want to come up here and do the panel for me?" But all kidding aside, we are a brand new 150-year-old company, and you guys can all do math and recognize that doesn't make sense. But we're celebrating our 150th anniversary this year. And at the same time, we've been making products for the Navy since at least 1926. We hope we go back a little bit further than that, but we're coming up on our 100-year anniversary of service to the Navy as well. We are so much more than just engines. Over the last 2 years, we've made a lot of acquisitions. We've really expanded our product portfolio. We now make motors, controls, valves, elevators, cranes, hoists, davits, so many other equipment. But we're at our heart We are a premier first-ranked Navy and Coast Guard defense contractor. Can you go to the next slide, please? Part of our mission is really to be where the customer is. So if we take a look at the map, you can see we're spread out all throughout America. We do have a location in the UK as well, but we're really wherever the Navy is, wherever the major shipyards are, that's where we really want to be. We have about 150 field service engineers, and part of the real focus and core of what we are is providing that exemplary service to all the products that we manufacture and support. So, and thanks for having me here today. I'm really looking forward to the session. So,
Great.
I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much. And we're off to a good start because you both kept within the timeline. I appreciate that. We were like on a tight ship around here. So.
As it should be.
All right. So I'm going to throw this one out for both of you. In your particular industries or segments of industry, kind of electronics and more in the mechanical side, what kind of have been the key drivers that you've observed that have driven elements of your parts of your industry overseas out of the country? What have been sort of the factors that have made that a reality? Tracy, let's start like first.
Well, for the broader electronics, I think that certainly some of the technology is driven overseas. Previous company I ran was more of an integrator of larger circuit board systems where you had to rely on some overseas technology. For Spartan, the technology is focused on a very repeatable, reliable system that we're able to replicate that and develop that and deliver that using US sourcing primarily. But the question of the broader electronics, it's certainly a tough one. And I think that the Navy is dealing with that challenge now, because as you look overseas for some of our electronics, now you've not only opened up business concerns, you've opened up security concerns, considering what can be embedded in some of that electronics. So I've lived through that as well, and I think we're still working through that as a Navy, as an industrial base. But I think that is driving more of an emphasis on Made in America because of the recognition of some of those security concerns as we've evolved over the last 15 to 20 years.
Like computer chips. I mean,
exactly, microprocessor,
Taiwan, right?
Microchip type level.
And
right.
as I understand, I think I've seen comments where we're trying to reestablish that back on our shores or building capability.
Absolutely. And there's some critical technologies that are U.S. only, and some of the electronics, and especially some of our high-end radar systems that we're well, I thought, my perspective, well protected. But I think there's a large array of as we move towards more of commercial off-the-shelf type solutions. Now we open ourselves up more to that. It's really commercial off-the-shelf. Who's the supplier? Who ultimately is the supplier of that? Is it a secure source?
George?
Yeah, thanks, Admiral. I think there's a few things going on there. Cost is obviously always one of the easy ones, and it's easy to point your finger there. But you have to also look at the market. The Navy just released a blueprint for 2023, 24 ships being decommissioned and 9 new ones. There's not a lot of volume out there, right? And so for companies that are going to make their living being a defense contractor, you really have to be able to manage that. And if you think about in that environment of only 9 ships, you're not going to be able to support a significant amount of overlap and contractors because there's just not enough business available, for them. And then when you layer requirements, IT requirements, cybersecurity requirements, all those things on top, it becomes a pretty prohibitive enterprise for folks that are out there, right? You really have to be kind of set and dedicated and say, this is who we are and what we're going to do to be able to survive. It can't be an afterthought.
Yeah. So that being said, why have some industries survived, or why have some segments survived so much better than others? And I guess it kind of gets to what you just said, but yeah. Are there some other factors that, either government policies that have, sort of required them to be there? Or, I mean, obviously the Jones Act comes to mind immediately,
right?
In terms of shipbuilding, but other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just to echo to what you said, I think that's right. The requirements are there. So if a company that understands that, can live within that, build their business around it, then they're probably going to survive and do well. Companies that aren't quite sure, you have a foot in a commercial camp, a foot in a defense camp, you might more struggle. From a made in America standpoint, or by U.S. standpoint, that's where I think some of the foreign companies get in trouble, because they just don't understand. They might think, oh, hey, the U.S. defense budget, it's $800 billion, right? This is a big market. But once you take a look at it, it's really not. And in order to really be able to participate, you really have to understand it. And I don't think a lot of companies out there do.
One thing I would add to that, it gets back to George's comment about it, the economies of scale. If you're just focused on a naval market, you have a challenge limited by the numbers that are available. But in the sort of the tactical side of businesses, where we have, especially in some of the complex payloads, missiles, and other type systems, if the government and the armed forces are able to have similar technologies, if not the same technologies, between the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps, now you've expanded that business case so companies can provide that dedicated support. So I think it encourages the government to look for opportunities to have commonality where it makes sense among the different warfighting areas, because certainly the economies of scale for the Army and the volumes you're talking about are significantly higher in many cases than the Navy. And if you can marry those two together, then that makes more business sense for a company that has the right technology that the government wants.
So what sort of policy things need to get put in place to kind of make that happen?
I'm not sure. I'll jump in there. I'm not sure about policies, but certainly more predictability, definitely a longer look, a longer view. What is coming down, more consistency, that would help everybody.
Ultimately, I think policy is a tough one to solve here, but between the different buying commands, when you have the naval buying commands, the Army buying commands, there's not a lot of incentives that I'm aware of. There may be some, but there's, until you get to top levels in DoD, I'm not sure there's a incentive to always pursue common solutions. There's certainly examples, and there's times that it's happened. I'm not sure you can dictate that, because ultimately the warfighter and the people who decide the resources and requirements have got to make the decision if it makes sense or not. But there is an affordability that can factor into that.
I'm thinking that of the many firms that have stayed under the U.S. flag and that have stayed operating in our nation, there are lots of elements of those industries that have gone overseas, even if the main kind of concern, I'm thinking like design. You go to many shipyards and the whole design, there's no design department anymore. It's all been shipped overseas. A lot of the R&D, that used to be kind of our bread and butter in the United States, we invented most of this stuff. A lot of that has sort of migrated away. Is it worth trying to get it back? Should we get it back? Is it, even get backable at this point, if that's a word?
Go ahead.
I think we have to be careful. While I don't disagree with that some has gone overseas, I think in some cases it may be a false choice. In some cases, we're bringing in or importing technology from other countries, and because it makes sense. And in many cases, that's done through companies that are U.S. companies. And so the question that I think you have to ask yourself is, what does made in America mean? Does that mean it was engineered in America? Does that mean it was designed? Does that mean it was manufactured? I think those are all different questions. And if it drives jobs in the U.S., then maybe that's made in the U.S. But at the same time, you don't want everything to be designed overseas. So I think there's space for a full range of examples of different variations on that theme.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think a great example of that's current is Fincantieri and the FFG design, right? They took the parent company design, I think, from Italy, have heavily modified it, customized it to what the U.S. really needs and requires. And I think that's pretty smart. I think that there's multiple cases where you can show that. You can take a core technology, but then you probably do need to customize it. There really are national security, requirements, limitations, exemptions that should be in place. The defense industry is not the toy industry, right? It's not we can't just say, oh, we'll buy anything off the shelf and we'll just use it. I mean, you certainly don't want to get into that example.
So, George, kind of staying with you, Fairbanks, which has been a long-standing engine maker, you've broadened out significantly here recently, as you sort of pointed out in your opening remarks. What sort of corporate decisions sort of drove you to wanting to broaden out like that and to, basically support the American shipbuilding industry to the extent that you're now going to be doing?
Yeah, it really drove from when we take a look specific to Fairbanks, right? So when we took a look at the market and we saw what are the core competencies that we really have, what are we really good at, and where can we grow, we realized that most people thought of us as an engine company, right? And we would have advertised ourselves as an engine company for 100 years. But we're really not an engine company. We really are a defense contractor, right? We know the U.S. defense, the naval defense, Coast Guard market incredibly well. And that really is what the competency really is. And so we layer that in with engines is obviously the core of what we do. But when we say that, then again, if we look at the Navy, we can say, okay, they're going to build 9 ships this year, 12 next year, 7 the year after. And so you can draw a sine wave around our business profile. And no business person in the audience wants to have a sine wave of results that you have to report to your board or whoever it is. And so if we're going to take a look at how are we going to grow, then we said, well, this is what we know, this is where we're going to be operating. And so we've been pretty successful at that so far, and I think the market's responded pretty well to our strategy.
Tracy, in your sort of area of expertise, maybe not even specific to Spartan, what has been kind of the trend with electronics and that sort of aspect of supporting U.S. manufacturing, U.S. industry?
Well, I think specifically, I will use Spartan as an example, specifically in the electronics associated with payload type electronics systems. While for many years our core has been sonobuoys, we see, again, taking our strengths to provide solutions in the broader undersea warfare, seabed warfare, and other evolving areas that new technologies are being applied to. We think some of those capabilities are able to be, and we're actually already doing many of those, and we see opportunity to produce more of those types of systems. From a business perspective, it's good to diversify to a certain extent. It's good to balance out portfolios. That's all part of it. But fundamentally, I think it's a capability that, again, as a former submarine or undersea warfare officer, leader, there's a demand out there, a need out there from the warfighter with our current national strategy, defense strategy, with both Russia and China. There's a need to continue our dominance in the undersea area, and there's an appetite for new and more payloads, and we have an expertise in producing those types of payloads, so we're looking to expand that. And I think that's similar to where other electronics-related tactical systems are. The Navy's got continuing evolving and challenging needs, and the companies have got to evolve and change to apply them.
So I read recently, and probably many of you did as well, over in the UK, the government came out with a very aggressive statement and investment in their shipbuilding industry. And it's like 10 billion pounds or something that they're going to inject into their shipbuilding industry, which is quite anemic, even compared to ours, because it is a national imperative. They have made that declaration that we've got to do that. Is it got to take something like that in this country to really supercharge us and get us moving in a different direction? Or do you think industry will just sort of go there on their own? To me, I think I think we almost have to have something like that.
Yeah, and I think it has to start with the Navy first, right? Laying it out and saying this is the serious strategy that we're going to pursue. These are the threats that we have. This is then the force structure that we need, which is significantly larger than what we have for a structure today. And then here's the requirements that are going to build that up. And I'm not sure that's been done as clearly as it could be.
If the CNO spoke to this morning, he made the point in the undersea and the submarine community, two SSNs per year, Columbia per year, 3 submarines from now until 2037, 2038. People can plan to that. Industry can plan to that. He made the point in context to say that we need to do that on the surface acquisition side as well. There's a recognition that you need to do that. Industry I don't think industry is going to respond without clear demand signals. It certainly makes it easier for them to make the investment that's necessary if they understand what direction the Navy's moving. But I was part of that Navy, right? And on active duty too, and developing those budgets and requirements. It's very difficult, but I think it's got to be improved upon to really drive industry in the direction that the Navy needs.
And, having that declaration come out from the highest level of government, is probably what it's going to take to really, move it along, much as will, I guess, remain to be seen over there, whether it actually takes root or not. But I think that was pretty significant, and probably what is needed on our shores too. But, obviously, there's a lot of pieces to making such a declaration, and a lot of other effects that have to be taken into account. Do you think another sort of radical movement might be a change in the way we manufacture? In other words, something that will alter the supply chain from where it is now, and I'm thinking more in terms of like on-site manufacturing, 3D printing, things where you just bring the raw material essentially to the manufacturing site, cut out all of the movement of finished products, something along those lines. Is that applicable, or could even be applied to our industries that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think absolutely. There's a home.
I mean, the iron ore and coke is right up where your neck of the woods, right?
Exactly, it's Wisconsin, right? No, I think that there's absolutely a place for additive manufacturing. I don't think it's a panacea that will then say all manufacturing will go away, and I don't think anyone's proposing that either. But there are certainly areas where it really makes sense, things that are reasonably complicated, reasonably low volume, where you don't want to set up and make a run on something. I know that the submarine side of the Navy is really exploring this. Things that are pretty old and they break, and then you've got to go get one of something, and the additive manufacturing process is fantastic. Somewhat complicated systems that have a lot of labor content. Also, I think it makes sense to do something with one piece rather than a system of 10 or 20. But I think it's always going to be a nice to have, a couple percent of your portfolio. It's certainly not going to be a significant part.
I agree on the additive manufacturing. I think to the point, we need to make progress there, but I'm not sure it's going to be the magic pill here. Yeah. Likewise, some folks talk about automation and automated manufacturing as another option. Again, I think there's opportunity and it should be used, we should work towards it, but it's not going to be a one case or one solution fits all cases. I think both of those are ideas and concepts that have been developed over time and have different degrees of success. And fundamentally, it gets back to requirements. Additive manufacturing is a great one, because if the Navy doesn't either relax or put in requirements that would have that, then it's going to be less likely the industry is going to move that way as aggressively. Automation is a little more, I think, on industry, because but they've got to make the investment in automation to potentially achieve the benefits of it.
Got it. I think anybody that saw on TV or witnessed the queue of ships sitting off of our western ports say we've got to figure out a different way. We got to make ourselves less dependent, both in, important aspects of our national security and supply chain, but also even in our domestic consumer goods. We're in a global economy. That's kind of where we have evolved to in the world. But there was something before that, and there's going to be something after that. It's, what's going to be the after? What's going to be the thing that replaces the economy as it stands now? So to that end, giving you both the opportunity to be king for the day, what would you say in your minds, in your world, would be those national priorities, those things that absolutely must be invested in, must be in our shores, must be part of our internal economy and not dependent on someone else?
Want to go first, Tracy?
No, go ahead.
All right.
Wants to jump on that one.
So I think it's actually, if we look at it with a national security or a defense lens, it becomes pretty easy. We just know we can't. I mean, we just lived through COVID. We lived through all of this. Currently the disruptions going on in Europe with Russia and Ukraine. You would have to really be foolish to say, oh, we should just have a free and open economy for everything without any restrictions. And hopefully nobody's advocating for that. And I think that if we then say there are critical national assets, there are things that the Navy or the Army, whatever the case may be, they have to be predictable. They have to be local. They have to be available. And that's I don't know, there's a reasonable short list of that. But real critical assets, things that wear out, things that break down, things that you need to be able to support for 40 years or 30 years, whatever the life of that ship is or that asset is. You certainly don't want to, even if it's I would say even a reasonably friendly country today, you don't necessarily know what is their policy going to be 20 years from now. And then suddenly you're now relying upon them. Or what happens if that's part of a small part of their business and they decide to divest it? That happened 2 years ago. We heard there was a company that nearly divested a big piece of their business to Russia, right? And it's out of control, right? And so those kind of things, it's just, you have to build them in the US, and there really shouldn't be an argument about it, right? And you just accept, okay, well, there's going to be some trade-offs that go with that, but the national security is above all. That's primary.
Tracy?
Well, I think to George's point about identifying critical technologies, components, that's done to some extent, but I think that would need to be more prevalent. I think the reality of acquisition is that unless those requirements, somehow that's embedded in the requirements, it's going to come down to cost. And the decision is a cost decision for the government. So unless we have the requirements somehow embedded in there, if there's a lower cost alternative that drives it offshore, then it's a very real likelihood that it will get awarded to someone who's bringing that in from offshore, unless we have the requirements fully integrated to restrict that. And in some cases that does happen, but I don't think it's enough. And I think that needs to be a focus area.
Yep, and to add on to what you both said, if I were king for the day, I think we need to maintain the distribution system for that, to wit, the Jones Act. And I hate to keep beating that drum, but I'm going to keep beating that drum because it is. I keep thinking back, in the current situation we're in, vis-a-vis Russia and potentially other future enemies. If we have had those entities into our internal distribution systems, we'd sure be looking at ourselves saying, how in the hell did we ever get in this situation? Why did we ever allow them to be in the middle of it? Yeah. Why have we turned over our keystone means of supporting our economic security and domestic security to foreigners, because they would be happy to have it. So I think obviously that's a key aspect of it as well. So at this point, we're kind of about halfway through. We'd like to go ahead and open up the mic to anybody that might have a question or comment to come forward. Captain Conrad.
When I look at pictures of Mariupol, it sadly reminds me of my childhood in the Bronx in the late 70s. I mean, the whole place was burned out, fires everywhere. My dad was a fireman. It was a war zone. And the Navy was coming out of Vietnam, unsure of itself, what it's going to do, where it's going to be. And then you had Japan with these electronics manufacturers and the shipyards, and they were taking off and doing really well. And the US couldn't get out of their own way. And there was this young hedge fund manager, John Lehman, and he came in and he called a friend of mine, Frank Coles, and he said, Frank, why is Japan doing better than us? Why are they shipbuilding better than us? And Frank flew out there, and while John bought Spartan Marine, and he found the efficiencies of the Japanese systems. He found the financial models, the subsidies, and he brought that into the US. Ronald Reagan was elected president. John Lehman was put in Secretary of the Navy. And then, what do you know, we have a 600-ship Navy. We've been here, we've done this before. But when I go and I ask, how is China subsidizing this? When I go to the Wall Street and ask this, it's credit default swaps, it's coded capital, it's all these investment things. When I talk to the Navy admirals about credit default swaps, I get a white face. So do we have spies in the Chinese shipyards that are giving information and sending them to you? Do we have financial guys who are giving you better default loans and all of that? What lessons can we learn to China to help your business? Thank you.
Well, if I had spies over there, I couldn't tell you. So, no, all serious. We certainly, I don't want to speak for Tracy, but I doubt that's the case. You know, it's at one level, I think what you said is, and I'm not disagreeing with you at all, is exactly right. But you go to Lehman in the 80s and the 600-ship Navy, that really started with vision, right? Which goes to what Buzz was saying just a few minutes ago. And I think there's parts of that are there today. But I sure don't think it's probably quite as clear as what it was, you know, in 1982, 1983 when that strategy was put together. You know, it was clear that Russia was the preeminent, you know, force back then, and now you could make a very credible claim that it's China today. And if we think about the U.S. Navy today, they've made it very clear that the nuclear Navy is their priority, right? Tracy spoke about this, right? 3 submarines a year and an aircraft carrier every 5 years. And that takes up a huge amount of the budget. And then there's all the other stuff that they still need: air, the rest of the surface force, all the other auxiliary ships and support ships. And we get into this argument over where's budget dollars and all this other stuff. And the bigger strategic piece, I think, sometimes gets lost.
Any thoughts?
You know, I would just, not to continue, but this hits again on the theme that I feel, which is that we are under real budgetary constraints. And I think that there's less of those constraints from China, from a per capita size. They're investing more. And you know, that covers up a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of, you know, maybe not so best practices. So I'm not sure that what there is to learn from China, other than if you want to commit to a national position, stature, posture, force structure, you've got to invest in it.
And that's a good point. It strikes me, you know, you mentioned John Lehman. One thing that we had at that time that we don't have now is a really solid national maritime strategy that encompasses not just, you know, the Navy, Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, but the Merchant Marine as well, which is something that's been missing from maritime strategies for some time. And that maritime strategy really has to come at the top. You know, when I was sitting as the administrator, I had a mandate from Congress to produce a maritime strategy. Well, that didn't go over so well. Number one, because most people in government did not acknowledge MARAD as the leader of the maritime sector, even though that's, you know, by congressional statute, that's kind of the mission: foster, promote, and strengthen. So I would say that, you know, any of that investment, any of that desire to move in a direction absent a strategy, an overall strategy that lays out the imperatives, national imperatives, and how it all fits together, all of the sea services, merchant marine included. Absent that, we're probably not going to get very far very quickly. You know, I sat in a couple of NSC meetings when I was the administrator where this was discussed. So at least it got discussed for 2 meetings, and then it went silent, never to be seen again. And the document that we ended up producing and to put a check in the block for Congress to hand back to them for their homework assignment was a 15-page, pretty high level, not a strategy, a kind of guidelines for how to do better at sea. And quite frankly, it didn't even begin to meet the requirements. So to really have a comprehensive document, policy, national strategy that encompasses all of the maritime aspects, of, you know, just as a for instance, I think is going to take what it really be what it takes. And I understand the Navy League is potentially going to be trying to spearhead an effort on their own to try and pull something like that together. So kudos to the Navy League to be pulling that forward.
Yeah,
so.
I agree.
Anybody else with a question or a comment? All right. Mr. Divins.
Yeah, Art Divins. This is a volume thing. I don't think a U.S. worker is an inferior worker to a Chinese worker or a Japanese worker or a Korean worker. It's a matter of volume. So, you know, I've been in shipbuilding for about 40 years here in the U.S. Cost of a ship is more than 60% material. So when you get a government program which requires everything by U.S., you're going to get a roll-up of what it costs to buy low-volume subproducts to a low-volume end product, and it's going to be very expensive. So how do you get the volume up? I think you start by every time we have a requirement in the United States, it gets built here in the United States. What we have now is when it gets too expensive, and I can name a whole bunch of issues, like sea lift, for example. Sea lift, the shipbuilding industry is given a requirement for $1 billion ship with all kinds of gold-plated bells and whistles. Too expensive, oh my gosh. A couple whacks at trying to get that price down. To build a ship that met the same requirements as the ships that we're buying is a fraction of that cost here in the United States. So what do? It gets too hard. It's a Navy's requirement for the Army. It's kind of here on the priority list. We'll just go out and buy a foreign ship. Doing that for sea lift ships. I'm seeing it now. Same story, cable layers. Can build those things here in the United States. On the commercial side, I just read, Maersk is buying a wind installation vessel for these green new jobs here in the United States in Singapore. That's providing a lot of work for our workers and our industry. It's providing a lot of tax revenue for the government because there's probably not an American company involved in that transaction, but it's for work here in the United States. So my feeling is it's all volume. When we go and buy a ship from a used foreign-built ship, it might be foreign-built. The 2 ships I think we thought were built in Japan, but the mother company who's getting that money from buying those ships is investing their revenues in China. They've got 9 orders for ships in China to replace the ships that they sold to us. Any comments on that?
I agree, Art, with what you're saying. I mean, we should be building all that here, right? It's a national security requirement. It's security, it's jobs, it's tax dollars, all of those things. And we do it because we say, like you said, it's too hard. Well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to do the hard things, right? So I agree with what you're saying.
Thanks, Art. Any other questions or comments?
Hello, my name's Frank Yelnick. I'm from Naval Air Systems Command down Pax River with the headquarters group. I do acquisition anti-counterfeit. manufacturing supply chain, and also acquisition and critical item management. So I got 3 hats down there. Over the last dozen or so years, with the global economic pressures have driven the supply chain in terms of the acquisition industrial base to sort of accordion out. So there's many, many more layers of the wedding cake tier of suppliers than ever before. Whereas maybe 12, 15 years ago, a aircraft prime, for example, would be making 60 to 80% of their content in-house because they've got to be globally competitive. Now it's as low as 20% or even lower. Consequently, you've got more tiers of suppliers, and all those tiers have now subbed out to stay afloat and be financially attractive and so forth. They're in business to make money. That's understood. But now that that's diversified and that wedding cake tier has become almost like a cloud at the bottom, you have many more tiers of suppliers. And consequently, instead of like critical parts being made at the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th tier, a lot of times they're made at the 7th or 8th tier. And now you've got sort of a reverse spider web where you may have a critical supplier, in my opinion, and this is where I'm sort of seeking your corporate sort of perspective, if you're sharing this sort of concern and how you guys are thinking about addressing it, where you have crucial suppliers way down, who not only are, let's say, NAV Air, but they're NAV Sea, Maritime suppliers, and Army suppliers, and Marine Corps suppliers, even Coast Guard suppliers, so it gets very convoluted. And you have one crucial supplier where if they go under, now you've affected all sorts of platforms, maritime, aviation, all sorts of things. So the first part of my question is, I'm just trying to, do you guys recognize that from the C-suite, as it were, from the corporate world? Do you guys recognize that as a concern? And second one, sort of branching off of that, a big cost savings push these days is COTS, which is great. I'm not being a naysayer. We've got to look at the whole environment. But sometimes, in my opinion, and from what I've seen, something that may be a perfect COTS solution for, let's say, an airliner, and now you're going to turn into a military patrol aircraft. And it could be the same thing for a vessel. Now, you're not going to see it probably so much at subs. There's no such thing as commercial subs that much these days. But it may be a perfectly good fit for them to have a supply base, but if you're going to convert it into military use, way down yonder at the bottom of that wedding cake tier, you've got somebody making maybe a valve or a circuit for the control of that vessel or the aircraft, but it may be fine if it's an airliner or a commercial vessel that it's made in a potential adversarial nation. But it certainly would be more of a risk if you've now got a DoD application. Do you believe, so those two things sort of go together. I'm looking to see what your corporate perspective is, and sort of like the third overlay of that, do you feel that in industry there's enough training or education happening from the primes down to their subs? Hey, think about this, at least when you guys are servicing the contracts for us. So sort of 3 interrelated questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll give you, my perspective, and I think it varies. Obviously, the bigger the program, the platform, an aircraft is a different animal than some of the things that we produce, but the dynamics are the same. And I think throughout a lot of my previous experience with NAVSEA, absolutely the proliferation, the need to expand the supply base. There's the proportional challenge that's introduced about security, and can you flow down the requirements? Can you have a surety? I think it's become very complex. I think that's one of the challenges that's emerged as a prime contractor, to realize that and then control that. It puts an infrastructure on a company that makes the big 4 or 5, the largest defense contractors. They have to have a large infrastructure just to manage that supply chain. You get into the mid-tier or smaller companies, and sometimes they don't have that infrastructure and are unable to do that. And that potentially introduces risk, potentially. But again, I think that the supply chain is smaller, depending on it all depends on the systems. So it varies. It's a challenge. I think that that some of the requirements that are flowing out of the buying commands, both NAVSEA and NAV Air, are providing clear direction on vetting of subcontractors. I think that's important because I think there is a role the government's going to have to help push that requirement to get flowed down through the primes to those subs. You can't just assume that the primes, if it's not a part of the contractual requirement, they're not going to do that, or they may not do that. So that's one element, my view of one element of it. I think there's a security piece to that, as well as an assurance that the stability of that supply chain. I think the point you mentioned about key suppliers that may be a key supplier for NAVSEA, but they're not, or they are for NAVAIR, maybe for Army. I think that one is a tough one because I don't know of a mechanism that would be able to keep track of that.
It's a communications issue.
It's right.
And tracking issues.
Yeah, so the buying power, if you will, as it translates there, I'm not sure that visibility, there may be a process I'm not aware of, but I suspect that's a difficult one unless those suppliers are providing all of that information to a particular buying command, NAVAIR, for example, so you get a visibility on it. It's really just for your awareness. I'm not sure what you do about that. That's just my view.
I'll just, in interest of time, just add one comment to what Tracy said, which is I actually see it the inverse of what you said. When we talk to the Navy, when we talk to the shipyards, our critical customers, they're much more concerned about there's a lot of suppliers out there that they're hanging on the edge and they may go under, right? And we have a lot more of those dialogues rather than a proliferation of a whole lot of new suppliers that are out there. So I think there may be a nuance to that.
It's a different world,
Yeah.
between aviation and maritime. And it's sort of like it's a cover to that one too. So if you may grant me just one question. A lot of times talking to my fellow organizational elements within DoD and outside, there's sometimes, although they're related, sometimes there's a conflation with logistical supply chain, the movement or shipment of stuff, that's so-called Amazon, Walmart stuff, the logistics, versus acquisition, subcontractors, manufacturer supply chain. In other words, somebody makes a little bit part that goes in assembly, sub-assembly, and then finally in a component, finally in a system. And a lot of times when I talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, we got that nailed, and I find out, well, really they've got a logistician or a logistics expert, which by all means is very important, but that may not be the right mindset to look at this wedding cake tier of suppliers. From the corporate world, do you sense that as well, or is not so much? Do you think people understand they're related, but they're two different things?
I see them as two different things. Awareness, I think it varies. I think those are decisions that we're constantly struggling with. Should we outsource this subassembly or not? And that factors into all of those factors. That's multiplied many times the more complex and larger the systems are. But I think there's awareness of the difference. But what you do with that awareness, I think, is going to vary among the companies and the industry.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tracy. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Thanks for your question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, and good afternoon. My name is Juliana Keeling. Thank you all so much for your time and for shedding light on this really important topic. Just move this down a little bit shorter. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Terrave. We are a global manufacturer of the highest quality, eco-friendly DFAT consumables. So really quickly, we'll do takeout containers, mess trays, cups, plates, straws. The whole concept is that they all look and perform just like plastic, but you can literally throw them overboard on a ship. You could bury them, burn them, incinerate them. It'll break down cleanly and fully. So one of the number one issues that's faced my business and many others in our industry is challenges from competition in China. I know we've discussed earlier in the conversation about being cost competitive, but what we've experienced is that Chinese companies are literally dumping products over here for less than the cost of fuel that it takes to actually ship it over here. Wow. So, one of the things to counteract the cost competition facet of this issue is, building it into the requirements. And that's something that we are actively focused on doing every day. So my question to you is, how do you go about doing that? Obviously there's the lobbying side of it. And I'm actually on the board of directors of an organization called Coalition for Prosperous America, which is focused on U.S. manufacturing. But from your perspective, how do you actually build that into the requirement? Thank you in advance.
Congratulations on your company. It sounds,
Yeah.
that's good stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For us, and it's probably, it may be just a different level, but we do a lot of work with Congress and a lot of work with the Navy to make sure that they really understand how critical those things are. But it's relentless, right? You can't just do it once a year, right? It has to be constant. There's folks in the audience that know me that know that, so they're probably tired of seeing me. So, but
What state
that's the
is
advice I
your
give.
company?
Yeah.
What state is your company from?
We are headquartered in Richmond, Virginia, but we have 16 different manufacturing plants across the U.S.
That's
Made in
fantastic.
USA.
16 different congressmen to go get
Yeah,
support.
exactly.
That's right.
Yes.
right.
But yeah, the challenge you have is, in some cases, we've talked about if there's a specific technology that you can factor security related. Yours is really more just a made in America requirement you're trying to establish. But yeah, I would agree with some of the thoughts of trying to get that support for the jobs in America to kind of perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Good luck.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. Hunter Stiers, I'm supporting Op 9957, and I'm a fellow with the Naval War College. Admirals, so I wanted to build on a comment that you made. It's first Captain Conrad's question and a comment that was made earlier about the sine wave of businesses that are focused on either the commercial or the military or the naval sector. Admiral, something I think we've discussed in the past is that the United States has embarked on this very dangerous experiment in history of attempting to be a naval power without also being a commercial maritime power. Because historically, the commercial maritime industry and the Navy have this symbiotic relationship. The Navy protects the trade overseas, and the industrial base of the commercial maritime industry is what builds the Navy, and then also pays for the Navy too. So I was curious, building on Captain Conrad's question, you mentioned in terms of the Reagan era, and John Lehman says halcyon era for the Navy. At the same time, you have, in that period of time, Reagan cuts the shipbuilding subsidy and then the operating cost subsidies, which had sustained the U.S. maritime industry for a very long time. They were core to building the largest and most powerful merchant fleet the world had ever seen in the Second World War. So, gentlemen, I would be curious, if you were advising MARAD and then also the industry players in this room who might be able to add their voice to the political conversation that's happening right now. We're seeing calls in terms of ocean shipping and trying to restore competitiveness in the ocean shipping sector. We're talking about made in America. We're talking the supply chain issues are really at the forefront. How would you advise MARAD and these industry players how would you advise them to lend their voice in terms of what kinds of solutions would you advise them to advocate for in terms of restoring perhaps a internationally commercially viable U.S. maritime industry and U.S. merchant fleet? Thank you.
That's a tough question, right?
That we have 59 seconds to
50,
answer.
I can filibuster. No, first off, I completely agree, and I'm thinking back. We had a meeting with the White House about a year or so ago, and it was on this exact topic. Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds, and she was very passionate about it, and we were left with this: what are the things that we can really do to really advocate for that, besides the work that we're already doing with Congress? But I do think that it's going to have to come down to some form of subsidization, right? Just to be competitive, to be able to compete with the Korean or Chinese or Japanese ship manufacturer. But it's necessary, right? It's necessary, and we did lose that, and I think we lost it in the 80s, maybe even the early 90s with the peace dividend, right? When we said, hey, 600 ship Navy, the maritime industry is going to be there, and then all of a sudden, we don't necessarily need a 600 ship Navy anymore, and boom, but it was already gone. So, but I agree with the premise of your question, and it makes it better for everybody to have that. that access to that market.
Tracy, any comment?
Nothing else to add. I think you covered it well.
And I would just add, kind of go back to my earlier comment, absent a national strategy, a national level strategy that comes out of the White House that sets it as an imperative that it must be for to go forward, then it's probably not going to happen. So,
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
thanks for the question. Well, we've reached the end of our hour, so thank you all very much. Thank you to Tracy and to George for your time this afternoon. Thank you all for coming, giving up your lunch, and we'll see you around
Thanks,
the hall.
everyone.